Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're digging into something pretty complex, the whole world of international relations, where, you know, what seems right personally often clashes with what countries actually do.
It's definitely a gray area. Rarely simple.
Yeah, and our starting point today was actually sparked by, well, recent news. Our source mentioned the U.S. bombing in Iran. That apparently got the speaker in our source material really thinking.
Right.
And that source is, it's a really interesting personal account from a YouTube video. The speaker talks about this intense discussion she had with a friend from Eastern Europe.
And that conversation really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? Personal morals versus national stances.
Exactly. So our mission today, let's try and unpack the tough questions this chat raises.
Yeah, we'll look at morality and geopolitics, what the superpowers were up to, and how nations like India, which is key to the source's perspective, kind of navigate all this. We're looking for those insights, the bits that help explain why this stuff matters to you.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good.
So the story starts with this Eastern European friend. Sounds like she didn't mince words.
Not at all.
She apparently called figures like Putin and Netanyahu killers, straight up. And she was pushing our source speaker, saying, you've got to stand by universal ethics, personal morality, pressing her on how she could possibly align with a country if its actions seemed, well, morally wrong by her standard.
Right. So what's fascinating there is that complete contrast.
Yeah, the friend's view is very much about individual conscience first. National loyalty, secondary. If a leader does something awful, you condemn it, period.
Simple as that for her.
Seems like it, but
Yeah.
that view, it often runs smack into the messy reality of international politics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So how did the source speaker push back? What was her counterpoint?
Well, she was pretty direct, too. She basically said when it comes to geopolitics, her loyalty is with India, her country first.
Okay.
And she talked about India's foreign policy changing. Used to be non-aligned, right? But the source suggests now it's more like all aligned. All aligned. What does that mean exactly?
As she put it, it means India stands with Ukraine and with Russia, essentially trying to be like a voice for peace, engaging with both sides.
Huh. So not just staying neutral, but actively engaging everywhere. That sounds, pragmatic.
Extremely pragmatic.
Yeah.
And she connects it directly to India's strategic needs,
Yeah.
mentions Russia and Israel specifically as natural partners.
Right.
So her stance, wherever my country stands, I stand there too. It's not just blind loyalty. It's tied to this idea that India needs to balance all these different, sometimes competing relationships to thrive.
Which really sets up the core tension, doesn't it? How do you juggle all that? Especially when the world wants you to pick a side.
Exactly. That's the big question it raises for nations trying to find their way.
So from that personal dilemma, the source then kind of zooms out, asking about morality on the bigger stage between nations.
Yeah, she basically asks, if we're talking ethics, who's really innocent here? Who gets to throw the first stone?
And she doesn't hold back on calling out specific nations, right? Particularly the U.S.
No, she doesn't. She directly questions American morality. Asks if the U.S. isn't a killer, too, pointing to things like the Iraq invasion or the chaos she sees in Syria, Lebanon, Sudan that she links to U.S. actions.
Wow. So her claim is pretty blunt. The U.S. has no morality in its foreign policy.
That's the quote, yeah. But then here's the twist. Despite that heavy criticism, she's also very realistic about the U.S.
How so?
She acknowledges it's the superpower, #1 economy, central to everything. You can't ignore it.
So even though she has these strong moral objections,
She argues it would be foolish for any nation not to align with the U.S. in some ways. Pure pragmatism, power realities.
I see. It's not an endorsement, just acknowledging the board.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that leads to her main point about idealism versus realism. She says flat out, morality doesn't run the world. She thinks war is bad, obviously it shouldn't happen ideally. But countries, she believes, run on ego and power. So some things are just idealistic talk and others are, well, just reality.
Okay, that focus on national interest and power brings us to a specific example she uses, the Middle East.
Right.
She puts forward a pretty stark idea that superpowers like the US and Europe actually benefit from the Middle East not growing or becoming stable.
Yeah, her argument is that the internal conflicts there, they basically serve the interests of outside powers.
How does she explain that?
She's quite critical of many nations in the region. She does exclude Saudi Arabia, saying they've managed things differently. But others, she calls them fools.
Ouch.
Yeah. She points to the internal fighting, Shia versus Sunni, even Sunni versus Sunni, these deep-seated conflicts. She mentions Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, saying they're too caught up in fighting each other to run their countries effectively.
And the source connects that internal chaos directly to superpower strategy.
Exactly. She suggests keeping the Middle East destabilized has always been the aim. Why? Because it keeps these oil-rich nations divided and easier to dominate, maintaining control over resources and the global power balance.
That's a cynical view, but you can see the logic she's presenting.
It's definitely a critical perspective. And she also singles out Iran's role in regional conflicts, questions why they needed to jump into the war, calls it a power play that hurts their own people.
And she feels the people in the region are being manipulated.
Yeah, she uses the word gullible, suggests they're being played by the U.S., Europe, Britain, caught in these larger geopolitical games.
Okay, so with that framework of power and maybe the absence of morality, she looks at specific conflicts. Let's talk Ukraine-Russia.
Right. She challenges what she calls the plain thought. You know, this simple narrative of Russia being the bad guy, the sole aggressor.
What's her alternative take?
She asks people to consider Russia's perspective, specifically their concerns about NATO expanding right up to their borders. Is NATO growth cornering Russia? She asks.
So she's suggesting it's more complicated than just one side being wrong.
Pretty much. Her point is, something is wrong on both sides. It's not just one story. She's pushing back against perhaps a very Eurocentric view of the situation.
It's a call for nuance, then, looking at the security dilemmas involved.
Exactly. How one country's defense looks like aggression to another. It's classic international relations theory, really, just applied to current events. Understanding everyone's anxieties, not just the side you might naturally sympathize with.
Okay, and then the source shifts to the Israel-Gaza conflict. Her perspective there sounds quite different.
It is. She offers a strong defense of Israel's actions.
What's the core of her argument?
She stresses that Israel's been attacked repeatedly since 1948, arguing they're always in defensive mode because of hostile neighbors. She tries to frame their actions within that context of, well, perceived existential threat.
Does she bring in history?
Oh yeah, big time. She mentions Israel's 3,000-year history in the region, arguing that gets ignored. She criticizes people who only look back to 1948 or maybe a few hundred years and ignore that deeper context. She asks, why is that history left out of the narrative?
It's a challenge to selective historical memory.
Definitely. And she connects this back to India, actually.
Yeah.
Says countries like India and Israel, they can't afford to outsource their defense like, say, some European nations might.
Because of their location.
Yeah, because they live in a hostile neighborhood, as she puts it.
Yeah.
So heavy defense spending isn't a choice. It's a survival necessity. It shows how geography and threats shape national priorities.
So bringing it all together, the source's main takeaway seems to be that stark statement, morality doesn't exist in international relations.
That's the headline, yeah.
So if that's the world we live in, according to her, what does that mean for a country like India or for, for you listening, trying to figure this all out?
Well, she talks about hypocrisy being everywhere. Nations talk a good game about ideals, but
actions speak louder.
right. She says, idealistic talks only work when the world is ideal. And since it's clearly not ideal, well, nations have to be practical. It's about power and self-interest, not high-minded principles, in her view.
So what's her advice then, specifically for Indian citizens watching all this unfold?
It's very direct. Support the country you live in or live in the country you support.
Yeah.
She clarifies it's okay to disagree on local stuff, politics at home. But on the international stage, she argues, citizens should try to understand and align with India's position. Know the difficult choices your country is making.
And she describes India's current position as very strange.
Right.
But what are the specific complexities she points out?
Yeah, several things. One is the risk she sees of a U.S. puppet government emerging somewhere nearby that could be hostile to India. Another is the economic hit from long wars. Driving up oil prices is a huge deal for India.
Okay.
And then there's the diplomatic balancing act. Maintaining good ties with Iran, they have historical links while also maintaining ties with Israel, who she calls a good friend.
That sounds incredibly tricky, juggling opposing sides.
It really is a complex web. India has to pursue its own interests, which sometimes means dealing with countries that are adversaries to each other.
So what we're seeing described is just raw pragmatism. India navigating a world where clear moral lines are blurred or maybe non-existent according to the source, and where national interest really is king.
Its own stability, its economy are all tied up in these global events. So the source argues India can't afford pure idealism. It needs smart, realistic foreign policy.
It means looking past the surface arguments, understanding the deeper plays.
That seems to be the core message.
All right, so the big takeaway from this deep dive, drawing from our source, geopolitics is, well, messy. A dirty game, as the source might imply. Clear morality, often missing. Nations act out of self-interest, power, history, not always lofty ideals.
Which leaves us and you with a pretty important question, doesn't it? In a world where national needs constantly seem to clash with supposedly universal values, what's our responsibility as individuals? How much do we need to understand the full picture, all the motivations, the history beyond just the easy headlines or the dominant story?
Yeah. How do you make sense of those clashes? Something to definitely think about.
For sure.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into some really complex global dynamics. We hope it sparks some thought and encourages you to keep exploring.
Until next time.
Until next time.